Hello everyone, this is your friend SG and this is the fifth part of the React interview ready series where we are covering all the React questions that are asked in the interviews. So in this video we will be covering React hooks, all the questions related to React hooks that are asked in the companies. If you haven't watched the previous parts yet, firstly go watch them and then you can resume from here. The link to the sheet, this Excel sheet where all the questions are mentioned, and the previous videos, you can find the links in the description. Go check out them and then resume from over. Okay, so let's begin the video. So the very first question is, what are React hooks? React hooks are the inbuilt functions that allow React developers to use state and other lifecycle methods inside the functional components. So as we know that all the lifecycle methods, they are only accessible inside the class functions. Now in order to use those features inside a functional component, React hooks were introduced. Initially all those features of the lifecycle components, they were not present inside the functional components. But after the introduction of React hooks, we can use the state and other lifecycle methods in the React hook in the functional components only. But there are some conditions to the use of these hooks. What are these conditions? Do not call the hooks inside the loops, inside conditions, or inside the nested functions. Hooks should always be used at the top level of the React functions. So the hooks, they cannot be used inside the functions, loops, or the conditions. They should always be present at the root level of the React functions. Okay. Some very common used hooks are useState, useEffect, and useRef, etc. So the next question comes, what all hooks are there in React? Explain. There are several hooks that are most commonly used in React. Some of them are useState, useEffect, useRef, useContext, useReducer, useCallback, and useMemo. So these are the most commonly used hooks. Okay, so we'll be studying all of them in detail. So the very first one is useState hook. The useState hook is that hook which allows us to have the state variables inside the functional components. As we know that the functional components, they are called the stateless components. Why? Because they don't have the states in them. Only the class components had the functionality of state. But after the introduction of hooks, the functional components can also now use the state with the help of useState hook. How they can use that? useState generates a single piece of state associated with that component, whereas the state in a class component is always an object. So as we know that while creating state in a class component, we created an object. Okay, so we can say that the state in a class component is an object, whereas state in a useState, while using useState hook, the state that we get, it is a single piece. It is not the object, it is a single value. Here we can see that it's a state. Okay, it's a single value. So it returns a stateful value, a function to update it. The initial value of the state can be passed as an argument. Here we can see that using useState hook, it returns us an array. What are the values in the array? First value is the value of the state, the name, and second is the function to update that. Okay, and optionally we can pass the initial value of the state as well inside the useState hook only. So the setState function, this one. This setState function accepts a new state value and performs a re-render of the component. Okay, so this is the useState hook. Using this, we get the functionality of state inside a functional component. So this is a very useful and the most used hook inside React. Why? Because it provides us the functionality of state inside a functional component. Initially only class components had this functionality, but now functional components can also use state using the useState hook. Next is useEffect hook. It accepts a function that contains the effectful code. All the side effects must be performed inside this hook only. useEffect hook accepts two arguments. The first one is the callback function that contains the side effect logic. useEffect executes the callback function after React has committed the changes to the screen. That is, after the render is committed to the screen. So here we can see that useEffect accepts two arguments. First one is the callback function. So basically what useEffect does is, once the component is re-rendered, useEffect hook is again called. So it accepts a callback function. So as soon as the useEffect hook is called, this callback function is again executed. Okay, and second is a it, as I said, that here it accepts two arguments. So second is a array of dependencies. It's an optional array of dependencies. Okay, what does this mean? That the values that are passed inside this array, based on these value only, useEffect hook will be again called. Let's say that we passed a state value count inside this dependency. After each render, it will check that the value inside this dependency array have changed or not. So we passed count. Now after each render, it will check that if the value of that count variable has changed, then only it will again call this callback function. Otherwise it won't call it. So based on this dependency array, the callback function is called or not. Okay, it is an optional dependency. If you don't pass it, then it will work differently. By default, useEffect runs after every completed render, but we can choose to fire it only when certain values have changed. Okay, so this is what useEffect does. Next comes the useRef. useRef is a built-in React hook that accepts one argument, the initial value, and returns a reference. Ref is an object having the property current. So this reference that is returned by the useRef hook, it has a property called current. Okay, so the two main things to remember about the references that are returned here, the two main things to remember about them are, the first one is the value of the reference is persisted between component re-renderings. That means the value of that reference, it remains same during different re-renders. If a component is re-rendered, the value of that reference doesn't changes. And the another thing is, updating a reference doesn't trigger a component re-rendering. Once a reference is updated, its value is changed, it won't trigger a component re-render. Okay, so these are the two things that we have to keep in mind about the references. So we can say that in working, the useRef hook is similar to the useState hook, but as the main difference between them is that this useRef hook, it doesn't perform the re-render once the value is updated. Okay, so we can consider useRef as useState only. There are some value, a value is being given to us, a value is returned, and we update that value. Between different re-renders, the value remains same, and same is with the state. Between different re-renders, the state value remains same, but the main difference between the useRef and the useState hook is that once the value of the useRef, the value that we got, it's updated, it doesn't perform re-render. Whereas once the state value is updated, re-rendering is performed. Okay, so this is the main difference between useRef and the useState hook. useRef hook can also be used to access the DOM elements. Here we can see that we created a reference using useRef hook, and this reference is assigned to the div element. Okay, so this is the div. Using the ref property, we have assigned this reference to div. Now if we want to get access to this ref, this particular div, we can do that using element ref.current. Okay, so the .current property of the reference, it is used to access the DOM elements. Okay, this could be used to access the DOM elements. So next is useContext hook. useContext hook comes into use when working with the React's context API. It allows us to access values from the current context. For example, the parent. We can access the values from the parent inside the components render methods, which is not possible in a traditional way. Okay, so if you are familiar with React context API, then you are also familiar with the concept what about the context. Okay, so what basically context does is it provides a state variable type of value. It provides us a global state, okay, which could be accessed by different components. So a value that is used by the parent could be accessed by its child without passing that value as props. So this is like a global state. Okay, so useContext hook allows us to use those values. It allows sharing of data between parent and its child components. This data could be state, props, functions, or any other thing. Okay, before using the useContext hook, we needed to create the context using create context and wrap the components inside the provider. Okay, so what we have to do, we have to use create context provided by React to create the context. Then we need to wrap our main function with the context.provider. Okay, so this counter context we created, so we wrapped the function, we wrapped our component with counter context.provider. Now we can access useContext hook inside this increment counter component. Okay, so this is the component, and inside that we are using useContext. Now these are the two values that we passed, counter and the increment. Counter is the value, state value, and increment is the function. We pass both of these values, and here using useContext, we can access those values. We can access increment and we can access the counter as well. Okay. Use context hook allows us to access the values of the context. Okay. Next is useReducer hook. So as the name suggests, useReducer. So if you are familiar with the concept of redux, reducers, dispatch, then this is a very familiar hook for you. Okay. So the useReducer hook is used for complex state manipulations and state transitions. So this is what basically is the task of redux as well. It accepts two arguments, a reducer function and an initial state, and returns an array with two values, state and the dispatch function. Okay. The reducer, dispatch and the state management are done in similar way as done in redux. Okay. So I'm not going into the depth of these reducer, dispatch and other stuff. This will extend the length of the video. So, and this is beyond the scope of this video as well. So I'm not going into the deep details of those concepts, but in the future videos, I'll be definitely coming out with a video on those concepts as well. But for now, you only need to understand this much from the interviews perspective, that what is useReducer. It basically performs the functions of complex state manipulations and state transitions. It works like the redux only, and it accepts two arguments, reducer function and an initial state, and returns an array with two values, the state and the dispatch function. So this much is sufficient from the interview's perspective if the interviewer asks you about the useReducer hook. Next is useCallback. So what is useCallback? UseCallback hook is used when we have a component in which the child is re-rendering again and again without the need. Let's say that there is a parent and has a child nested inside it. Now if something changes in the parent which won't affect the child, then we don't need the child to be re-rendered. But the default behavior of React says that if the parent is re-rendered, then child will also be re-rendered. But this re-rendering of the child was not useful, was not beneficial for us. It was just wastage of memory and time. So useCallback hook provides us the functionality so that we can memorize that particular function and we can prevent its re-rendering. This hook accepts an inline callback and an array of dependency and will return a memorized version of the callback. This hook is used to memorize the functions between different renders. Okay, this line is very important. This hook is used to memorize the functions between different renders. Okay, so let's see with this and let's understand this with an example. So this is a counter component where we have two counts this time, not single one, two counts, count and the other count. And here we have three different buttons, increment the count, decrement the count and increment the other count. Now these are three functions. Increment is updating the count, decrement is decreasing the count, and increment other counter is updating this other counter. Now what will actually happen is that if we update the count, we click on this increment button and we update the count, then all the three functions will be again re-rendered. But there is no need of rendering this again, this increment other counter function again, because there is no change in other counter. And similarly, if we update the other count using this function, then there is no need of re-rendering these two functions again. But by the default behavior of React, these functions are re-rendered again. So what we can do, we can use the useCallback hook here, and we can memorize these functions using that. So now it accepts two arguments. First is the callback and second is the optional array of dependencies. So now we have rewritten these functions as this. So first what we have done, we have memorized these functions. Okay, so the very first one is const increment, and we have passed the function inside the useCallback hook and passed the dependency. What is the dependency? It only depends on the count variable. So we have passed that. Similar is done for decrement and similar is done for the increment other counter. And in the increment other counter, we have passed the other counter as dependency. Now, if we update the counter, then the third function of the increment other counter won't be re-rendered because that its dependency hasn't changed. And similar goes for the other counter. If we update the other counter, then the first two functions won't be re-rendered again because the count variable, the count value of this count variable hasn't changed. So the first two functions won't re-render again. Okay, so this is what useCallback hook does. It memorizes the entire function and it persists that memorized function between different renders. So this saves us a very large amount of unnecessary re-renderings. Okay, so next is useMemo hook. This hook is also similar to the useCallback hook, but the main difference is that useCallback hook memorizes the entire function, whereas useMemo hook, it only memorizes the particular value that is returned by that callback. Okay, useMemo is a built-in React hook that accepts two arguments, a function that computes the result and a dependency array. During initial rendering, useMemo invokes the function, memorizes the calculation result and returns the result. Keep this in mind. It memorizes the calculation result, not the entire callback function. Okay. If during the next renderings the dependencies don't change, then the useMemo doesn't invoke the function but only returns the memorized value. But if the dependencies change during the re-rendering, then useMemo invokes the function, memorizes the new value and returns it and stores it. Okay. So the main difference between the useCallback and useMemo is that useCallback memorizes the entire function while useMemo memorizes only the value returned by that function. Okay. So this is the main difference. Keep this in mind. So for this video, we are only going this till here only. Okay. The video length has been a bit longer. So stay tuned to the channel. For the coming video, we'll be completing the video in the next part. Okay. Till then, watch the previous videos and cover all the questions. If you have any doubts, you can ask me in the comments. Okay. Thank you. Tata. Bye-bye.